They left her there like forgotten furniture. Not even a proper goodbye, just a signature on paper and footsteps fading down the hall. But Eleanor Whitmore had survived worse than this, and the world would soon learn what it cost to discard her. Eleanor had once ruled rooms the way monarchs ruled kingdoms. Born into East Coast affluence, she spent her youth in silk and privilege. Her estate in Connecticut had 15 rooms, 3 gardens, and a staff that called her Madam, even when she insisted on Eleanor. The family fortune, inherited from a chain of textile mills dating back to the 1800s, had survived depressions, recessions, even 2 world wars. But in the end, it was her children who ruined her. The nursing home was nothing like her estate. The carpet smelled faintly of bleach and chicken soup. A flickering fluorescent light buzzed near the vending machines. Her room, if you could call it, that was a converted storage unit at the end of the hallway, with peeling wallpaper and a single narrow window. The day her daughter Amanda signed the forms, Eleanor didn't say a word. She simply watched her, in a way that made Amanda shiver. "Mom, it's for the best," Amanda had said. "You'll get better care here. It's what Dad would have wanted." Eleanor didn't respond. She knew the truth. Amanda and her brother, Jacob, had grown tired of their mother, tired of her standards, tired of her opinions. Most of all, tired of waiting for her to die and free up the inheritance. They thought she didn't know, but Eleanor had always seen what others missed. On her 3rd day at Meadow Pines, she unpacked her suitcase. It was a Louis Vuitton case, stitched leather, polished brass. The only item inside, a faded photograph of her late husband, Gregory, and a tiny porcelain rabbit she'd had since childhood. She sat in the worn recliner by the window and stared out at the dying hedges for hours. "She won't last a week," whispered one of the aides to another. "Old rich ones never do. They come in all fire and perfume and leave in a bag." But Eleanor did not die. She adjusted. She learned the names of the other residents. She noticed the patterns: the nurses who stayed past their shift to help with a bedpan, the orderlies who pocketed valuables. She learned about Sylvia in room 302, who'd been a pianist at Carnegie Hall, and Harold across the hall, who still believed the war hadn't ended. And slowly, she began to observe something much more interesting: the quiet economy of Meadow Pines. There were deals being made. Money exchanged hands for small favors, for extra dessert, for painkillers, for silence. And in that chaos, Eleanor saw opportunity. One week in, she called Amanda. "I'd like to sell the house," she said, voice calm. "You? What?" "You heard me. The house, the art, the cars. I'll leave you and Jacob your share, of course." Amanda stammered, her polished attorney voice cracking. "Why now?" "Because I'm not dead yet," Eleanor said, "and I'd like to use my money before someone else decides how it should be spent." She hung up before Amanda could protest. The next day, she called her lawyer. It took 2 months, but the Whitmore estate was liquidated quietly. Eleanor instructed the funds to be transferred not to her children, but to a private trust under her control. Amanda and Jacob never saw a cent. Then the changes began. First, a new TV for the dayroom. Then fresh flowers in the cafeteria. Real coffee, not the freeze-dried kind. A beautician came in weekly. A retired chef was hired part-time. The staff at Meadow Pines whispered about it for days, but no one could prove anything. When they asked Eleanor, she simply smiled and said, "I like to be comfortable." By Christmas, every resident had a new winter coat, slippers, and a warm scarf. She became the center of gravity in the building. Staff began to linger near her door, asking for advice. She helped a young nurse draft a business plan for her future clinic. She taught a grieving widow how to manage her late husband's pension. But not everyone approved. The facility director, George Renshaw, a gray-haired man with soft hands and hard eyes, called her in one morning. "This isn't a country club, Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "No," she replied, "but it could be less of a prison." He leaned forward. "Your influence is disrupting the system. People are expecting more. That's not sustainable." only because it never was before. She met his eyes without flinching. For a moment, Renshaw saw the woman she used to beta, one who negotiated international mergers in heels and pearls. "You're not in charge here," he said. "No," she replied, rising slowly from the chair. "But you're not either, not really." That night, the heating in the East Wing failed. Eleanor organized a volunteer effort from within the residence. Blankets were gathered. Tea was brewed. Not a single complaint was filed. The local news picked up the story. Residents rallied to support each other during heating crisis. The article included a picture of Eleanor, arms crossed, eyes defiant. After that, visitors came. Community members dropped off donations. Volunteers started showing up. Meadow Pines, once a forgotten place for the elderly, became a story of unlikely rebirth. And Eleanor kept building. She started hosting Tea Tuesdays, inviting residents and staff to her room. She read them poetry, told them stories of her childhood, listened to theirs. One day, a frail woman named June said, "I haven't laughed like this since my husband died." Eleanor held her hand and said, "Then let's make sure it's not the last time." But as her circle grew, so did the resentment. Renshaw began tightening controls. He cut visiting hours, reduced budgets, restricted staff overtime. Eleanor saw the signs. She called her lawyer again. This time, she made a bolder move. She purchased 51% of the holding company that owned Meadow Pines. Quietly, discreetly, through a network of shell companies, trusts, and silent partners. A skill she'd mastered during her corporate days. 2 months later, Renshaw was called into a board meeting. When he walked in, he saw her at the head of the table. "Mrs. Whitmore?" he asked, confused. "Miss Whitmore, again," she corrected. "I've been widowed quite long enough." He laughed nervously. "What is this?" "This," she said, sliding a file across the table, "is the new ownership structure." He opened it. "Read." Blinked. This isn't legal. You can't." "I can," she said. And I did. She stood, adjusted the pearl brooch on her lapel, and extended a hand. "You're being let go, Mr. Renshaw. Effective immediately." By the end of that week, Eleanor was no longer a resident. She was the director. But she didn't move out. She kept her modest room, the same narrow window, the same recliner. Because Meadow Pines was no longer a nursing home to her. It was her empire, her redemption, and her revenge. The world had expected her to fade quietly, to become a forgotten name on a will. Instead, Eleanor Whitmore rewrote the final chapter of her life and gave everyone around her the power to do the same. Eleanor's ascent was met with stunned silence from staff, residents, and her own children, who still thought they held the strings. Fortunately for her, power had a way of bending expectations. Act 2. Rising Influence. The day after the board meeting, Eleanor arrived early. She wore a tailored gray suit that whispered authority rather than shouted it. With each step down the corridor, heads turned. Even the maintenance crew paused to nod respectfully. She called an impromptu meeting in the converted storage-turned office, the same cramped space she'd once regarded as her prison. "Thank you for being here," she began. Her voice was calm, but carried a resonance that held attention. "My vision for Meadow Pines is simple: dignity, community, and care." She outlined her plan: renovate the East Wing, launch a small garden, hire a part-time counselor, start intergenerational programs with local schools. She had already set the wheels in motion. Questions came fast. What's the budget? Will this affect staffing ratios? How will we attract families? Eleanor answered each, drawing on spreadsheets she'd reviewed the night before. She'd studied insurer regulations, staffing metrics, and neighborhood demographics. She knew exactly what she was doing, and it showed. That afternoon, the construction crew arrived to begin repairs and install new windows in the East Wing. The residents watched from their wheelchairs, their eyes lighting up like children's when they saw fresh paint and gleaming glass. Sylvia the pianist performed Claire de Lune, In the refurbished common room next morning, her frail fingers dancing across the keys, filling space with something neither time nor illness could tarnish. Eleanor slipped into the seat at the end of a bench and let the music wash over her. A tear traced her cheek, not from grief, but from fulfillment. On that very first evening, a teacher-led choir of local school children arrived to perform carols. The residents and kids greeted each other shyly at first, but soon laughter reflected through the windows and around corners, bridging generations that the world had long since separated. Eleanor watched, arms folded, the faintest of smiles on her lips. She knew she'd won the war for joy. Act 3, unsettling calm. But retreating into victory was never her style. Eleanor was always looking ahead, always probing for weak points, places to shore up. And there was one. Amanda and Jacob. They had not forgiven her. Not yet. They raised legal challenges, undue influence, mental incompetence, coercion. They hired lawyers. They demanded audit rights. They filed motions. But Eleanor had anticipated this. She had undergone neuropsychological testing, had her signature independently verified, and had legal counsel present every step of the way. When her children's attorneys subpoenaed Meadow Pines financials, Eleanor's team complied confidently. The books were irrefutable. Every dollar was tracked, every expense approved. No mismanagement, no impropriety. The judge dismissed the case within weeks. Amanda stormed into the nursing home one afternoon, looking for confrontation. The place was buzzing, new upholstery in the lounge, a pottery workshop underway, the scent of fresh bread in the air. She found Eleanor by the garden, tiny green shoots poking through fresh soil. "Mom," she began. Her voice shook, part anger, part something else. "Yes," Eleanor replied, kneeling beside a tulip bulb. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "There's no pleasure. You betrayed us. You stole from us." Eleanor stood slowly, brushed dirt from her sleeves. She didn't argue. She didn't explain. "Stealing implies wrongdoing," she said softly. "I simply chose a different path." Amanda stared. The words hit harder than any shove. "You've ruined our inheritance." "Did I?" Eleanor reached out, gently stroked Amanda's cheek. "Or did I free you from the expectation of fortune?" Amanda flinched. The word expectation hung between them like a guillotine. They didn't speak again. Amanda left that night, furious. Jacob followed in silence. For a moment, Eleanor considered regret, but all she felt was resolve. She looked back at the gardenia patch of green against gray cement and smiled. Act 4, resolution. By April, spring had breathed life into Meadow Pines. The garden bloomed with tulips and pansies. The pottery workshop produced mugs etched with personal messages. On Fridays, a volunteer barber sharp-edged haircuts. On Sundays, a retired reverend held interfaith services. Attendance at Tea Tuesdays tripled. Families began visiting. Phones buzzed again with conversations rarely heard in those halls. Eleanor walked the halls each morning, greeting everyone by name. She encouraged newcomers. She shared memories. She listened. One mid-April afternoon was particularly clear, sun warm, breeze soft. She found Junwo had once said that laughter had died planting daisies in the garden with a smile that creased her once sad face. "Look at you," Eleanor said, handing June a small watering can. "Happy?" June nodded. "I don't feel forgotten anymore." Eleanor's chest tightened. Because neither did she. In late May, at the annual board meeting hosted in the bright common room, Eleanor unveiled the Meadow Pines Foundation. Funds would cover subsidized care for underprivileged seniors. An endowment would finance free activities, gardening, arts, intergenerational programs for those on fixed incomes. She revealed the initial donation from herself. Murmurs rippled through the room. George Renshaw, the former director, now a consultant on the board, stood. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, voice steady despite emotion, "you've done more for this place than any of us thought possible." Eleanor looked at him, then around the room. Staff, residents, families, they were her community. Thank you, George. But this wasn't about one place. It's about giving dignity to those we forget. To show that Lafino matter the ages, not for shelving. Applause rose. Some feet tapped hesitantly, others boldly. When George joined her at the podium, they shared a warm Glancean, unspoken acknowledgement of how far they'd both come. That evening, under strings of lights in the garden, Eleanor hosted a gathering. Residents, staff, families, volunteers all mingled. A soft breeze carried laughter and chatter. The scent of lilies filled the air. The community felt alive. Eleanor stood back, watching a child's hand in June's, staff trading stories with seniors. She thought about power, how it could be wielded to control or to lift up. She chose the latter. The night deepened. Stars twinkled. Someone began singing "Bridge Over Troubled Water." Voices joined. A chorus for unity and care. Eleanor breathed in the moment. She had begun her story abandoned, discarded. Now she stood at its heart, surrounded by a community she built, a legacy that would outlive her, and a life rewoven with meaning. As the celebration carried on beneath the twinkling garden lights, Eleanor excused herself quietly and returned to her room. It was no longer a converted storage space. A local donor had insisted on remodeling it after hearing her story in the news. The walls had been painted a soft cream. A large bookshelf lined one side of the room, filled with poetry, biographies, and even a few finance textbooks she had requested. Framed photos of other residents, smiling with her, sat beside the old one of Gregory. The porcelain rabbit still held its place on the bedside table. She sat at her writing desk and opened her journal. Her hand trembled slightly as she began to write. May 28th. Today, the home felt like a village again, a place full of life, not just the slow winding down of it. I watched June hold a child's hand, and I saw Harold laugh at a joke about tick-tockvin, though he still calls it click-clack. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't known I'd missed. Belonging. She paused, her pen hovering. There was something else, something unspoken. Eleanor closed the journal and looked out the window. The moon was full, pale and proud. The following weeks passed in a golden haze. There were more garden projects, more activities. A grant arrived from the state for innovation in elder care, thanks, in part, to a proposal Eleanor helped write herself. A mural was painted on the north wall of the home by a group of high school art students. It depicted a tree growing out of stone, its branches wrapped in the hands of young and old. At its base, a small plaque read, "To Eleanor Whitmore, who showed us how to grow again." She pretended not to cry when it was unveiled. But that night, alone, she allowed herself to weep quietly into her pillow. Not from sadness, not anymore, but from the overwhelming truth that her life, her real life, hadn't ended when she was left here. It had begun. One hot morning in July, Eleanor received a letter. The envelope was thick, ivory-toned. She recognized the handwriting immediately. Amanda. Inside was a short note. "Dear Mother, I've spent weeks trying to write something that didn't sound angry or bitter, but the truth is I don't know how to feel anymore. I see your name on the news. I hear your voice in the interviews. You're being called a hero, a revolutionary in elder care, a force. But all I can think about is how you didn't choose us. You chose them. And maybe that's not fair. Maybe we weren't worth choosing. I don't know. But I do know this. Jacob and I are going through our own reckoning. We were handed everything and expected more. Maybe this was your lesson. Maybe you knew we wouldn't learn until we were angry enough to question ourselves. I'm still angry, but also impressed. I'm trying to hold both. Yours, Amanda." Eleanor folded the letter carefully. She didn't cry. She didn't laugh. She simply felt the weight of time. And for once, it didn't crush her. It humbled her. That afternoon, she gathered 3 residents, June, Harold, and Sylvia, and asked them to meet in the garden. She stood before them with a sketchbook and a folder full of documents. "We're building something," she said. They exchanged puzzled looks. Not just here. Something bigger. She revealed the plan, a network of care homes modeled after Meadow Pines. Not just a franchise, but a movement. Each home would be community integrated, resident-led, and financially transparent. With art, nature, connection. I want your help, she said. To design it. To name it. To tell the world it's possible. Harold, ever skeptical, raised an eyebrow. At our age? You want us to build an empire? Eleanor chuckled. No, I want us to rebuild the world. 3 months later, at a press conference in Hartford, Connecticut, Eleanor stood behind a podium bearing the logo of a new organization. Rooted Life, a new chapter in elder care. Reporters gathered. Cameras rolled. Her voice, though softer now, carried like a bell. We don't age out of value. We don't retire from meaning. We don't stop being part of the world just because our hair turns silver. She held up a photo June laughing with a young boy in the garden. This isn't a project. It's a promise. The crowd rose in applause. Behind her, on stage, stood Sylvia, June, and Harold, each of them wearing the same pin, a tree growing from stone. One final chapter closed on Eleanor's 82nd birthday. She celebrated at Meadow Pines with a garden party. Old friends flew in. The mayor arrived. The staff made her favorite lemon cake. A jazz quartet played softly under the trees. Toward the end, Amanda appeared. She stood just outside the gate, uncertain. Eleanor noticed immediately. She walked over, unhurried. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Then Eleanor extended a hand. Amanda hesitated, then took it. And in that grasp, there was no apology, no punishment, just understanding. Because some wounds aren't meant to vanish, only to be held. Together, autumn arrived in golden hues, and meadow pines carried the scent of baked apples and cinnamon. The air grew cooler, but the warmth within the home had never been stronger. Eleanor walked slower now. Her hips ached, and her steps were deliberate. But her mind? Sharp as ever. The Rooted Life initiative was gaining traction. 3 new facilities across New England had signed up to follow her model. Community leaders were inviting her to speak. Universities were asking her to consult. Foundations wanted a partner. She always gave the same answer. I'll help, but I won't leave my home. Because despite the fame, Eleanor knew where her soul lived now. In these halls, in these people, in this purpose. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, she remained in the garden. The leaves rustled, and wind whispered through the branches. A soft blanket rested on her lap, and a cat, Margot, the stray who'd adopted them, all curled up beside her feet. She sat alone, but never lonely. That was the difference. She thought of Gregory, as she often did, not in mourning, but with peace. I think you'd like what I've become, she whispered. I think you always saw it, even when I didn't. Somewhere nearby, wind chimes sang their quiet chorus. A week later, the call came. Jacob. She hadn't heard his voice in nearly a year. Hi, Mom, he said, his voice raw. Eleanor gripped the receiver tighter. Hello, Jacob. A pause. Then, Amanda told me about the letter. She wrote beautifully. She did, he said. I'm not there yet, but I'm trying. That's all I ever wanted. He sighed. I saw the news. Rooted Life is everywhere now. I didn't plan for that. It just happened. It's good. Really good. You did something incredible. We did, she corrected gently. I didn't do this alone. A beat of silence. Then Jacob's voice softened. Would it be all right if I came by sometime? Eleanor closed her eyes. I'd like that very much. Thanksgiving came with snow. The dining hall was transformed. Long tables, pine garlands, candles flickering. Staff and residents cooked together. Cranberry sauce from scratch. Pies lined up on windowsills. Children from the local elementary school arrived with handmade placemats. Eleanor wore her pearl earrings, Gregory's favorite, and a forest green shawl. She sat at the head of the longest table, not because she demanded it, but because everyone insisted. Jacob arrived just as the first dish was served. He brought wine. Good wine, Eleanor's favorite Cabernet. She laughed when she saw the label. You remembered. I never forget the expensive things, he joked. They talked over dinner. He asked about Harold's health, about the garden, about June's poetry club. He didn't ask for money. He didn't mention the estate. He just listened. And when the meal was done, he took her plate and walked it to the sink himself. That night, Eleanor sat in her room, the wine warming her chest, and wrote a single line in her journal. He came back whole. December brought colder nights and warm rituals. The residents decorated the home with garlands and handmade ornaments. The menorah glowed in the lounge. Carolers came on Fridays. Hot chocolate stations popped up near the elevators. A memory tree stood by the main entrance, every ornament inscribed with a person's name and the year they arrived. Eleanor placed hers high up, careful to balance it just so. She paused for a long moment before stepping back. Looks good there, said June, sipping cocoa behind her. Eleanor smiled. Feels right. On the 21st of December, a blizzard rolled in. Snow blanketed the town. Roads were shut. Deliveries canceled. But Meadow Pines stayed warm. Generators hummed. Staff stayed overnight on cots. Eleanor, once again, organized the relief effort. Food rations, activities, medical check-ins. She sat beside Sylvia, who had fallen ill, holding her hand through the night, whispering lullabies from a long-forgotten youth. When the storm cleared, the facility remained untouched, like it had weathered more than just wind and snow, like it had been protected by something deeper. That night, Eleanor sat with her journal again. We were forgotten once, she wrote. Now we are remembered every day. In January, the local college awarded her an honorary doctorate in social change. She didn't attend the ceremony. Instead, they came to her. The president of the university arrived in a suit and scarf, braving the wind to hand her the diploma in person. Cameras clicked as Eleanor stood, frail but proud, and accepted the scroll. She gave a short speech, barely 3 minutes. Change doesn't begin in boardrooms or politics, she said. It starts in forgotten corners, in overlooked people, in rooms just like this. The press quoted her everywhere. But her favorite reaction came from Sylvia, who leaned over and whispered, I always knew you were a doctor of something. They both laughed until they coughed. February brought with it a small decline. Eleanor began to tire more easily. Her steps slowed further. The walk to the garden felt longer. Her appetite waned. June noticed first. You're fading, she said gently one morning. Eleanor nodded. I think it's time. You're not scared? No, Eleanor whispered. Because everything I came here to do is done. But what about the homes? The movement? They'll go on, with or without me. She handed June a thick folder, legal documents, passwords, handwritten letters to future directors. You'll lead, Eleanor said. You already do. June took the folder with shaking hands. On March 4th, Eleanor asked for one final tea Tuesday. Residents gathered, not knowing what to expect. The table was set with fresh flowers, cucumber sandwiches, Earl Grey. The sun streamed in through the window, golden and calm. Eleanor stood slowly and cleared her throat. I want to thank you all, she said, for allowing me to live again. She paused. I came here abandoned, broken, angry. A few heads bowed. But you didn't just welcome me. You challenged me. You reminded me who I was. And more importantly, who I could still become. Silence followed, thick with emotion. I don't know how much time I have left, but I do know this. I'll spend every second grateful, because I was not buried here. She smiled. I was planted. Tears fell freely, not in sorrow but in reverence. That night, Eleanor dreamed of the sea. She stood at the edge of a cliff, wind in her hair, the ocean roaring below. Gregory stood beside her, young again, holding her hand. They didn't speak. They just watched the sun rise. On the morning of March 8th, Eleanor Whitmore passed away in her sleep. She was found in her chair by the window, journal open, a pen resting lightly in her hand. The final entry. We were never too late. only waiting to begin. The news of Eleanor Whitmore's passing spread faster than anyone at Meadow Pines expected. It began with a quiet announcement on the home's website. Then, a post from the Rooted Life Foundation. Then came the phone calls, the messages, the letters. Within 48 hours, news outlets across the country were running stories with headlines like, "Social change pioneer Eleanor Whitmore dies at 82. From forgotten to revolutionary. The life of a nursing home queen." She wasn't buried. She was planted. Even international outlets picked up the story. But at Meadow Pines, the mood was not one of loss. It was something softer, something steadier. It was legacy. The memorial took place 5 days after her passing. There was no cathedral, no red carpet, just a white tent in the garden Eleanor had helped bring to life. Chairs lined the paths she once walked daily. At the front, her photograph, framed in silver, resting between 2 vases of wildflowers. She was smiling in the picture, not posed, but caught mid-laughter on one of the Tea Tuesdays. Everyone was invited. Residents, staff, families, community members, volunteers, children from the school who used to draw with her on Tuesday afternoons. Even the mayor attended. Jacob and Amanda sat together in the front row. Jacob held a folded letter in his jacket pocket, the final one his mother had left him, sealed in soft cream paper and marked simply with his name. Amanda wore her mother's pearl earrings, gifted to her just weeks before Eleanor's final days. June opened the ceremony. Her voice was hoarse, but steady. She told me once that most people fear being forgotten more than they fear dying. But she didn't die afraid. She died knowing we remembered. Silence fell like snow. And we will keep remembering. Because she made sure of that. Each resident who spoke added something different. Harold told a story about how Eleanor once caught a young aide stealing from a medicine drawer, and instead of calling the police, she sat him down, listened to his story, and helped him enroll in night classes. Sylvia shared how Eleanor read her poetry out loud when she couldn't get out of bed every morning for a month. A volunteer shared how Eleanor held her hand after a miscarriage and stayed until sunrise without saying a word. One of the local students, 8 years old, Freckles, missing 2 teeth, walked shyly up to the podium and simply said, "She made me feel important." That was enough. Later that evening, after the guests had left and the moon had climbed above the rooftops, the staff and residents gathered one last time beneath the tree in the center of the garden. Each person held a candle. June stepped forward and lit hers from a small flame. She said, "We were never too late," June whispered, "that every life has another beginning." She turned to Jacob, who now stood in his mother's place on the Rooted Life board. Jacob lit his candle, tears in his eyes. And she was right. One by one, each person lit their candle. And as the flames grew, the air filled with warmth. They sang not a hymn, not a dirge, but "What a Wonderful World." Soft, imperfect, true. 6 months later, Rooted Life had grown. 5 more homes adopted Eleanor's model. 3 more were in development. A dozen community colleges had added her story to their elder care and nonprofit management curricula. National conferences invited speakers from Meadow Pines. And at the center of it all was June. She took the helm not with bravado, but with quiet strength. She didn't wear suits like Eleanor. She didn't speak like a CEO, but she led like a woman who had learned from the best. She told the board, on her first day, "I'm not Eleanor, but I'm someone she believed in. And that's enough." Jacob visited Meadow Pines monthly now, not out of obligation but desire. He brought books, played chess with Harold, and helped with garden maintenance. He also worked behind the scenes to secure new funding for Rooted Life. Amanda returned too, though less frequently. She was slower to speak of their mother, but she stayed in touch with June. She asked about Eleanor's legacy. She helped archive her letters. One day, she stood in front of the framed journal page, the one Eleanor had written the night before she passed. "We were never too late, only waiting to begin." Amanda touched the glass, then whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on us either." 1 year later, The first Eleanor Whitmore Fellowship was announced as a scholarship for women over 65 starting a new chapter. The first recipient was a 70-year-old immigrant from Laos who opened a bilingual daycare center in Boston. At the award dinner, she said, "I never thought anyone cared what I did after 60. Then I read about Eleanor Whitmore, and I thought maybe the world is just beginning for me." Eleanor's portrait hung behind her on the stage. 3 years later, the memory tree still stood. It had doubled in size. Each spring, a new set of ornaments was added, each with a name, a year, and one word of hope. Growth, rebirth, purpose, forgiveness, home. Visitors came from across the country to walk the garden paths, tour the halls, and speak to the residents. Many asked the same question: how did one woman change everything? And June always gave the same answer: she didn't. She just reminded us that we still could. 5 years later, Meadow Pines hosted its first national conference on elder-led communities. Over 200 attendees, speakers from all 50 states, panels on governance, dignity, grief, laughter. Jacob opened the conference. He spoke briefly. Then, he looked down at the front row, where Amanda now sat with her own teenage daughter beside her. He said, "We thought our mother's legacy was about a nursing home." He paused. But it was really about what happens when we finally see each other again, when we stop running from aging, from vulnerability, from time itself. He smiled. She didn't make the world softer. She made it braver. 10 years later, a biography was published. Planted, Not Buried: The Life of Eleanor Whitmore. It hit bestseller lists within weeks. A studio optioned it for a limited series. The book was required reading in hundreds of college classrooms. But in a quiet drawer at Meadow Pines, the original journal remained. Unpublished, untouched, preserved in Eleanor's own hand. A private record of a woman who didn't vanish into the quiet. A woman who rose from abandonment, broke the mold, and lit a path for others. And every spring, on the anniversary of her passing, the staff and residents still gather beneath the tree. Candles are lit, stories are shared, and one phrase is always whispered into the wind: she was never too late. The end.